Continuing, Fabius, from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. The army, seeing Hannibal's attendants come back from viewing the enemy in such a laughing condition, concluded that it must be profound contempt of the enemy that made their general, at this moment, indulge in such hilarity. According to his usual manner, Hannibal employed stratagems to advantage himself. In the first place, he so drew up his men that the wind was at their backs, which at that time blew with a perfect storm of violence, and sweeping over the plains of sand, carried before it a cloud of dust over the Carthaginian army into the faces of the Romans, which, being much disturbed them in the fight. In the next place, all of his men he put into his wings, and in the body, which was somewhat more advanced than the wings, placed the worst and the weakest of his army. He commanded those in the wings that, when the enemy had made a thorough charge among that middle advanced body, which he knew would recoil as not being able to withstand their shock, and when the Romans in their pursuit should be far enough engaged within the two wings, they should, both on the right and the left, charge them in the flank, and endeavor to encompass them. This appears to have been the chief cause of the Roman loss. Pressing upon Hannibal's front, which gave round, they reduced the form of his army into a perfect half-moon, and gave ample opportunity to the captains of the chosen troops to charge them right and left on the flanks, and to cut off and destroy all who did not fall back before the Carthaginian wings united in their rear. To this general calamity it is said that a strange mistake among the cavalry much contributed, for the horse of Amelius, receiving a hurt and throwing his master, those about him immediately alighted to aid the consul, and the Roman troops, seeing their commanders thus quitting their horses, took it for a sign that they should all dismount and charge the enemy on foot. At the sight of this, Hannibal was heard to say, "This pleases me better than if they had been delivered to me, bound hand and foot." For the particulars of this engagement, we refer our reader to those authors who have written at large upon the subject. The consul Varro, with a thin company, fled to Venusia. Amelius Paulus, unable any longer to oppose the flight of his men or the pursuit of the enemy, his body covered with wounds, and his soul no less wounded with grief, set himself down upon a stone, expecting the kindness of a dispatched blow. His face was so disfigured, and all his person so stained with blood, that his very friends and domestics passing by knew him not. At last, Cornelius Lentulus, a young man of patrician race, perceiving who he was, alighted from his horse, and, tendering it to him, desired him to get up and save a life so necessary to the safety of the Commonwealth, which at this time would dearly want so great a captain. But nothing could prevail upon him to accept of the offer. He obliged young Lentulus, with tears in his eyes, to remount his horse. Then, standing up, he gave him his hand, and commanded him to tell Fabius Maximus that Amelius Paulus had followed his directions to his very last, and had not in the least deviated from those measures which were agreed between them, but that it was his hard fate to be overpowered by Varro in the first place, and secondly by Hannibal. Having dispatched Lentulus with his commission, he marked where the slaughter was the greatest, and there threw himself upon the swords of the enemy. In this battle it is reported that 50,000 Romans were slain, 4,000 prisoners taken in the field, and 10,000 in the camp of both consuls. Now, to charge forth into the battle, that sort of stuff, that's not suicide. Well, it's suicide. People say that, but it's not the same thing as the people who, in World War II and otherwise would, kill themselves in an attack against the enemy. It's like, well, if the enemy kills you, that's not suicide. If, you do, it is, The friends of Hannibal earnestly persuaded him to follow up his victory and pursue the flying Romans into the very gates of Rome, assuring him that in 5 days' time he might sup in the capital. Nor is it easy to imagine what consideration hindered him from it. It would seem, rather than some supernatural or divine intervention caused the hesitation and timidity which he now displayed, and which made Barcus, a Carthaginian, tell him with indignation, "You know, Hannibal, how to gain a victory, but not how to use it." Yet it produced a marvelous revolution in his affairs. He who hitherto had not one town, market, or seaport in his possession, who had nothing for the subsistence of his men but what he pillaged from day to day, who had no place or retreat or basis of operation, but was roving, as it were, with a huge troop of banditti, now became the master of the best provinces and towns of Italy, and of Capua itself, next to Rome, the most flourishing and opulent city, all which came over to him and submitted to his authority. It is the saying of Euripides that a man is in ill case when he must try a friend, and so neither, it would seem, is a state in a good one when it needs an able general, and so it was with the Romans, the consuls, and actions of Fabius, which before the battle they had branded as cowardice and fear. Now in the other extreme they accounted to have been more than human wisdom, as though nothing but a divine power of intellect could have seen so far and foretold, contrary to the judgment of all others, a result which, even now it had arrived, was hardly credible. In him, therefore, they placed their whole remaining hopes. His wisdom was the sacred altar and temple to which they fled for refuge, and his counsels, more than anything, preserved them from dispersing and deserting their city. As in the time when the Gauls took possession of Rome, he whom they esteemed fearful and pusillanimous when they were, as they thought, in a prosperous condition, was now the only man in this general and unbounded dejection and confusion who showed no fear but walked the streets with an assured and serene countenance, addressed his fellow citizens, checked the women's lamentations, and the public gatherings of those who wanted thus to vent their sorrows. He caused the Senate to meet. He heartened of the magistrates, and was himself the soul and life of every office. He placed guards at the gates of the city to stop the frightened multitude from flying. He regulated and confined their mournings for their slain friends. Well, perhaps you shouldn't bewail the dead, but you're mourning, you mourn who you mourn, even people you had no contact with, both as to time and place, ordering that each family should perform such observances within private walls, and that they should continue only the space of 1 month, and then the whole city should be purified. The feast of Charis happening to fall within this time, it was decreed that the solemnity should be intermitted, lest the fewness and not the sorrowful countenance of those who should celebrate it might too much expose to the people the greatness of their loss. Besides that, the worship most acceptable to the entities is that which comes from cheerful hearts, but those rites which were proper for appeasing their anger and procuring auspicious signs and presages were, by the direction of the augurs, carefully performed. Fabius Pictor A near kinsman to Maximus was sent to consult the oracle of Delphi, and about the same time 2 Vestals having been detected to have been violated, the one killed herself, and the other, according to custom, was buried alive. Above all, let us admire the high spirit and equanimity of this Roman commonwealth, that, when the consul Varro came beaten and flying home, full of shame and humiliation, after he had so disgracefully and calamitously managed their affairs, yet the whole senate and people went forth to meet him at the gates of the city, and received him with honor and respect. And silence being commanded, the magistrates and chief of the senate, Fabius, amongst them, commended him before the people, because he did not despair of the safety of the commonwealth after so great a loss, but was come to take the government into his hands, to execute the laws and aid his fellow citizens in their prospect of future deliverance. When word was brought to Rome that Hannibal, after the fight, had marched with his army into other parts of Italy, the hearts of the Romans began to revive, and they proceeded to send out generals and armies. The most distinguished commands were held by Fabius Maximus and Claudius Marcellus, both generals of great fame, though upon opposite grounds. For Marcellus, as we have set forth in his life, was a man of action and high spirit, ready and bold with his own hand, and, as Homer describes his warriors, fierce and delighting in fights, boldness, enterprise, and daring, to match those of Hannibal, constituted his tactics, and marked his engagements. But Fabius adhered to his former principles, still persuaded that, by following close and not fighting him, Hannibal and his army would at last be tried out and consumed, like a wrestler in too high condition, whose very excess of strength makes him the more likely suddenly to give way and lose it. Now, you can say that that when it comes to fascist aspects of government, like police and military, that there's more bravery in the people who charge forth, even though they don't like to fight. And you could also say that the ethics that they're put upon, or they put themselves upon, are more likely to be followed if they're, not per se pleased by mere violence. Posidonius tells us that the Romans called Marcellus their sword and Fabius their buckler, and that the vigor of the one, mixed with the steadiness of the other, made a happy compound that proved the salvation of Rome, so that Hannibal found by experience that, encouraging the one, he met with a rapid, impetuous river, which drove him back and still made some breach upon him, and by the other, though silently and quietly passing by him, he was insensibly washed away and consumed, and at last was brought to this, that he dreaded Marcellus when he was in motion, and Fabius when he sat still. During the whole course of this war he had still to do with one or both of these generals, for each of them was 5 times consul, and as praetors are proconsuls or consuls, they had always a part in the government of the army, till at last Marcellus fell into the trap which Hannibal had laid for him, and was killed in his 5th consulship. But all his craft and subtlety were unsuccessful upon Fabius, who only once was in some danger of being caught, when counterfeit letters came to him from the principal inhabitants of Metapontum, with promises to deliver up their town if he would come before it with his army, and intimations that they should expect him. This train had almost drawn him in. He resolved to march to them with part of his army, and was diverted only by consulting the omens of the birds, which he found to be inauspicious. And not long after it was discovered that the letters had been forged by Hannibal, who, for his reception, had laid an ambush to entertain him. This, perhaps, we must rather attribute to the favor of the entities than to the prudence of Fabius. Now, 'daemon' is a word that actually goes over pretty well meaning-wise with fairy. because they're both entities that people thought had ability over fate. In preserving the towns and allies from revolt by fair and gentle treatment, and in not using rigor or showing a suspicion upon every light suggestion, his conduct was remarkable. It is told of him that being informed of a certain Marcian, eminent for courage and good birth, who had been speaking underhand with some of the soldiers and deserting Fabius, was so far from using severity against him that he called for him and told him he was sensible of the neglect that had been shown to his merit and good service, which he said was a great fault in the commanders, who reward more by favor than by desert. But henceforth, whenever you are aggrieved, said Fabius, I shall consider it your fault if you apply yourself to any one but to me. And when he had so spoken, he bestowed an excellent horse and other presents upon him, and from that time forwards there was not a faithfuler and more trusty man in the whole army. With good reason he judged that if those who have the government of horses and dogs endeavor by gentle usage to cure their angry and untraceable tempers, rather than by cruelty and beating, much more should those who have the command of men try to bring them to order and discipline by the mildest and fairest means, and not treat them worse than gardeners do those wild plants, which, with care and attention, lose gradually the savageness of their nature, and bear excellent fruit. At another time some of his officers informed him that one of their men was very often absent from his place, and out at nights. He asked them what kind of man he was. They all answered that the whole army had not a better man, that he was a native of Lucania, and proceeded to speak to several actions which they had seen him perform. Fabius made strict inquiry, and discovered at last that these frequent excursions which he ventured upon were to visit a young girl with whom he was in love. I presume he means a young woman, but I don't like this referring to people under 30 as boys and girls. It's unless they're actually children, Upon which he gave private order to some of his men to find out the woman and secretly convey her into his own tent, and they sent for Lucanian, and calling him aside, told him that he very well knew how often he had been out away from the camp at night, which was a capital transgression against military discipline and the Roman laws, but he knew also how brave he was, and the good services he had done. Therefore, in consideration of them, he was willing to forgive him his fault, but to keep him in good order, he was resolved to place one over him to be his keeper, who should be accountable for his good behavior. Having said this, he produced the woman and told the soldier, terrified and amazed at the adventure, "This is the person who must answer for you, and by your future behavior we shall see whether your night rambles were on account of love or for any other worse design." Well, love of the body is lust, so it's a type of love, but another passage there was something of the same kind, which gained him possession of Tarentum. There was a young Tarentine in the army that had a sister in Tarentum, then in possession of the enemy, who entirely loved her brother, and wholly depended upon him. He being informed that a certain Bruttian, whom Hannibal had made a commander of the garrison, was deeply in love with his sister, conceived hopes that he might possibly turn it to the advantage of the Romans, and having first communicated his design to Fabius, he left the army as a deserter in the show, and went over to Tarentum. The first days passed, and the Bruttian abstained from visiting the sister, and neither of them knew that the brother had notice of the amour between them. The young Tarentine, however, took an occasion to tell his sister how he had heard that a man of station and authority had made his addresses to her, and desired her, therefore, to tell him who it was, for, said he, if he be a man that has bravery and reputation, it matters not what countryman he is, since at this time the sword mingles all nations, and makes them equal. Compulsion makes all things honorable, and in a time when right is weak, we may be thankful if might assumes a form of gentleness. Upon this the woman sends for her friend and makes the brother and him acquainted, and whereas she henceforth showed more countenance to her lover than formerly, in the same degrees that her kindness increased his friendship, but also with the brother advanced, so that at last our Tarentine thought this Brutine officer well enough prepared to receive the offers he had to make him, and that it would be easy for a mercenary man who was in love to accept, upon the terms proposed, the large rewards promised by Fabius. In conclusion, the bargain was struck, and the promise made of delivering the town. This is the common tradition, though some relate the story otherwise, and say that this woman, by whom the Brutian was inveigled to betray the town, was not a native of Tarentum, but a Brutian born, and was kept by Fabius as his concubine, and being a countrywoman and an acquaintance of the Brutian governor, he privately sent her to him to corrupt him. Whilst these matters were thus in process, to draw off Hannibal from scenting the design, Fabius sends orders to the garrison in Rhegium that they should waste and spoil the Brutian country, and should also lay siege to Colonia and storm the place with all their might. These were a body of 8,000 men, the worst of the Roman army, who had most of them been runaways and had been brought home by Marcellus from Sicily in dishonor, so that the loss of them would not be any great grief to the Romans. Fabius, therefore, threw out these men as a bait for Hannibal, to divert him from Tarentum, who instantly caught at it, and led his forces to Colonia. In the meantime, Fabius set down before Tarentum. On the 6th day of the siege, the young Tarentine slips by night out of the town, and having carefully observed the place where the Brutian commander, according to agreement, was to admit the Romans, gave an account of the whole matter to Fabius, who thought it not safe to rely wholly upon the plot, but while producing with secrecy to the post, gave order for a general assault to be made on the other side of the town, both by land and sea, this being accordingly executed, while the Tarentines hurried to defend the town on the side attacked. Fabius received the signal from the Brutian, scaled the walls, and entered the town unopposed. Here, we must confess, ambition seems to have overcome him, to make it appear to the world that he had taken Tarentum by force and his own prowess, and not by treachery. He commanded his men to kill the Brutians before all others. Yet he did not succeed in establishing the impression he desired, but merely gained the character of perfidy and cruelty. Many of the Tarentines were also killed, and 30,000 of them were sold for slaves. The army had to plunder the town, and there was brought into the treasury 3,000 talents. Whilst they were carrying off everything else as plunder, the officer who took the inventory asked what should be done with their entities, meaning the pictures and the statues. Fabius answered, "Let us leave their angry gods to the Tarentines." Nevertheless, he removed the colossal statue of Hercules, had it set up in the Capitol, with one of himself on horseback and brass near it, proceedings very different from those of Marcellus on a like occasion, and which indeed very much set off in the eyes of the world his clemency and humanity, as he appears in the account of his life. Hannibal, it is said, was within 5 miles of Tarentum. When he was informed that the town was taken, he said openly, "Rome then has also got Hannibal. As we won Tarentum, so we've lost it." And in private with some of his confidants, he told them, for the first time, that he always thought it difficult, but now he held it impossible, with the forces he then had, to master Italy. Upon this success, Fabius had a triumph decreed him at Rome, much more splendid than his first. They looked upon him now as a champion who had learned to cope with his antagonist, and could now easily foil his arts and prove his best skill ineffectual. And indeed the army of Hannibal was at this time partly worn away with continual action, and partly weakened and become dissolute with overabundance and luxury. Marcus Livius, who was the governor of Tarentum when it was betrayed to Hannibal, and then retired into the citadel, which he kept till the town was retaken, was annoyed at these honors and distinctions, and on one occasion openly declared in the Senate that by his resistance, more than by any action of Fabius, Tarentum had been recovered. On which Fabius laughingly replied, "You say very true, for if Marcus Livius had not lost Tarentum, Fabius Maximus had never recovered it." The people, amongst other marks of gratitude, gave his son the consulship of the next year, shortly after those whose entrance upon his office, there being some business on foot about provisions for the war, his father, either by reason of age and infirmity, or perhaps out of design to try his son, came up to him on horseback. While he was still at a distance, the young consul observed it, and bade one of his lictors command his father to alight, and tell him if he had any business with the consul, he should come on foot. The standers-by seemed offended at the imperiousness of the son towards a father so venerable for his age and authority, and turned their eyes in silence towards Fabius. He, however, instantly alighted from his horse, and with open arms came up, almost running, and embraced his son, saying, "Yes, my son, you do well and understand well what authority you have received and over whom you are to use it. This was the way by which we and our forefathers advanced the dignity of Rome, preferring ever her honor and service to our own fathers and children." And, in fact, it is told that the great-grandfather of our Fabius, who was undoubtedly the greatest man of Rome in his time, both in reputation and in authority, who had been 5 times consul, and had been honored with several triumphs for victories obtained by him, took pleasure in serving as lieutenant under his own son when he went as consul to his command, and when afterwards his son had a triumph bestowed upon him for his good service, the old man followed on horseback his triumphant chariot as one of the attendants, and made it his glory that while he really was, and was acknowledged to be, the greatest man in Rome, and held a father's full power over his son, yet he submitted himself to the laws and the magistrate. But the praises of our Fabius are not bounded here. He afterwards lost his son, and was remarkable for bearing the loss with moderation, becoming a pious father and a wise man, and as it was the custom amongst the Romans upon the death of any illustrious person to have a funeral oration recited by some of the nearest relations, he took upon himself that office, and delivered a speech in the Forum, which he committed afterwards to writing. After Cornelius Scipio, who was sent into Spain, had driven out the Carthaginians, defeated by him in many battles, out of the country, and had gained over to Rome many towns and nations,